Well, you want a hero? You got a hero. He's our next guest. His name is Steve Thomas, one of the finest people I have ever had the privilege of meeting. Steve, and I'll just read off the jacket of Jean Benet inside the Ramsey murder investigation. Steve was the lead detective in the Ramsey case, and Steve received more than 100 commendations and awards during his 13-year police career, including the Award of Excellence and the Medal for Life-Saving, for assignments ranging from recruit training and SWAT to special investigations and undercover narcotics. Prior to Jean Benet, Steve worked on multi-state task force investigating racketeering and organized crime that resulted in numerous grand jury indictments. But let me tell you what really matters. This is a very good person, and I came to know Steve during the years he was investigating the Jean Benet case, and eventually had the privilege of representing him when he was falsely accused of not honoring service of process in a related case. And it was just a flat-out false allegation, Craig, and eventually the process server who claimed he had served Steve had to admit on the stand that he had committed perjury, and the charges against Steve were dropped. But I'll tell you this. You can be sure of one thing, that nobody has used more of their God-given talents and given up more of their life to try to find the killer of Jean Benet Ramsey, whoever that may be, than our next guest, Steve Thomas. Steve, welcome to 630 KHW.
Well, thank you, Dan, and I'm humbled by your kind words, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's our honor, Steve, and we know that you haven't talked about this for 5 years. I believe it's been about 5 years since you've spoken publicly about the Jean Benet case. So if you would, start just by telling Craig and me and our listeners, why haven't you discussed it for the last several years, and why now?
Well, and hello, Craig. Good afternoon.
Hey, Steve. Thank
you for having me.
Thank you for being on. I remember when we met while we were doing Good Morning America from Diamond Hill, and I was always impressed by you. I was that morning as well, and I agree with Dan, and nobody wanted to solve this case more than you.
Well, I appreciate those words, Craig, and after I left police work and resigned in 1998. I would later, when it was apparent that no one was going to be charged in this case, wrote a book about my experiences, and unfortunately, I was subsequently sued by the Ramseys for that effort, and after all that concluded, I chose to simply refrain from public comment, not because I had to. I continue to occasionally do law enforcement training with Mark Class and some others behind closed doors, but I just really wanted to return to a much-sought private life, and believe me, my interest in the case has not waned, and I followed it very closely, but quietly until 12 days ago, my phone began ringing, and I just witnessed probably the most bizarre series of events I think I've ever seen, and certainly concerning this case.
Well, Steve, Mary Lacy caused those events to occur. What can you tell us about Mary Lacy, her involvement in this case? Back in the day, she was a chief deputy under Alex Hunter. I know you had some interaction with her. Just tell us your thoughts about Boulder DA Mary Lacy.
Well, I pulled my book off the shelf and dusted it off as this was going on the other day, and flipped through it, and towards the end of the book, I noticed a paragraph in which I make specific mention of Lacy, and even in 1998, the summer of 1998, she was a staunch defender of the Ramseys, and I noted that in the book, and Patsy in particular, and you mentioned Craig, Alex Hunter, and I have been critical of the former district attorney in the past, and I've tempered that over the years, a little time and distance. I think in hindsight that at least I think he was giving it a genuine effort, and quite frankly, at least he was in the same ballpark, the same zip code as the Boulder Police Department. And I told a friend yesterday, I said, what I've just witnessed with Keenan Lacy makes Alex Hunter look like Rudy Giuliani. I said, moreover, Craig, Keenan Lacey has now lost all credibility within the police community, and that, I think, poses a real and immediate problem.
Well, Steve, let's talk about that, because I think all anybody has to do is have the pleasure of meeting you and speaking with you, reading your book, to understand the depth of your commitment to finding justice for JonBenet. So what is the impact now of this, as I call it, wild goof chase on the effort to find justice for this little girl?
Well, Dan, and you hit the nail on the head. I think this is the definition of the proverbial wild goose chase. For a number of reasons. I'd like to get into those in a moment, but the immediate impact is, I think, it certainly diminishes the ability of this district attorney, because now I think there's a credibility issue to ever try to bring any other suspect into court. For example, she has been have criticized her within the law enforcement community that she's been rather myopic in her sole focus on an intruder. And I think now, if she were to arrest anybody else, I think there's the credibility question that it would be difficult. Because let's face it, quite frankly, Carr, presumption of innocence and finding a jury was never going to be an issue, because I don't think I spoke to anyone in the last 12 days who ever took Carr seriously as the killer of JonBenet Ramsey.
Steve, if I could just ask you about the possibility of justice for JonBenet, do you regard the DNA in her panties as a significant clue? Since you left the police department in 2003, they used STR technology to enhance that DNA, so much so they could say it was a Caucasian male and that it wasn't blood or semen, but a cough or a sneeze. Do you buy that, or do you have skepticism about DNA solving this case?
Well, Craig, I've heard you speak very eloquently and articulately on TV about this in recent days, and I've never held myself out as a DNA expert, and in fact, we deferred to Henry Lee and Barry Scheck and others. But you're right. In the last 8 years, there's been tremendous DNA advancement. But then again, Mike Cain has publicly stated on the record that the DNA in the underwear is of such minimal quantity that it may have been a rather casual contact. And Craig, I think I'll leave that to others and to experts to argue in the end as to whether or not DNA is going to be the end-all in this case. But clearly, in regards to Mr. Carr, there were too many other gaping holes with him as a suspect to even make the DNA an issue.
Stephen, it was interesting as I went back this weekend and reread your book cover to cover. Steve Thomas, by the way, our guest, the lead detective in the Ramsey case. You had mentioned in your book prophetically that there might be technological developments with DNA testing in the future that would, shed some further light on what role the DNA should play in the case. But if you can stay through a break, would love to come back and speak with you some more about your reaction to the story many are just learning of as they leave work, that now the district attorney actually made an arrest in the Ramsey case, and it turns out that she has to just cut this guy loose after a DNA test that should have been done before he was even brought here. A man who just put his heart and soul into finding the killer of JonBenet Ramsey. On the line with us, Steve Thomas. His book, JonBenet, it was so compelling. And when we're done with the interview with Steve, I want to just quote the very last few lines of the book. They just bring a tear to your eye. You're with Dan and Craig. Steve Thomas, our guest on 630 KHW.
We are positive that, from the time period that he had his children, that he's never missed a Christmas with his children.
John Carr's brother looking right about now. Mary Lacey looking very wrong on a lot of levels. I tell you, as the son of a cop who I respect more than anybody in the world, it is such a great privilege to have another great cop on air with us. Steve Thomas, who was the lead detective in the Ramsey case, joins us to talk about the aftermath of today's shocking revelations. Now, Steve, those who wanted to discredit the direction you were taking in this investigation, tried to attack your credentials as a detective. But you know what? All of those commendations and awards and all the cases you solve speak louder than those folks who had their own little mission to pursue. But you tell us, as a detective, how do you view what you saw unfold over the last 12 days or so? How do you view the course of action that Mary Lacy took?
Well, I refrained from any public remarks or comments because, as Craig can tell you, a cop doesn't want to jeopardize, obstruct, or get in the way of what Keenan had working. And suffice it to say that I was sufficiently skeptical, but it wasn't my place to say anything because I had to trust that she had more than what was being publicly discussed. I also had a great deal of trust that given what I watched from Bangkok to Los Angeles back to Colorado, and that she would not have been doing all of this without one heck of a very good reason for doing so. And Craig knows this. There's only three ways that investigators solve a crime, either through a confession, through evidence, or through witnesses. And if she was relying solely on incriminating confessionary statements from Carr to the CU Professor Michael Tracy, I had to believe that she was exploring the witness angle because witnesses who may or may not provide alibi or exculpatory information, and if I had to believe that she wasn't relying solely on incriminating or confessionary statements without exploring the evidence nexus, hard, physical, unassailable evidence. But as this thing moved forward and the cracks became apparent, and I think Craig pointed many of those out on television, then I've got to say now in hindsight, I would be shocked if she were relying solely on email exchanges with this CU professor.
Yeah, let's talk about him, Steve, because old law enforcers do think alike, and I'm heartened to believe that even you, who was so close to the case, and I thought after reading all the books, I knew a lot about it, but I think maybe you and I both were hoping against hope that there could be some justice for JonBenet, and both of us were more than glad to say, hey, our original theories were wrong, because we assumed she had to have more. But what about Michael? Go ahead.
You're exactly right. I mean, you, I, Dan Capilis, I think everyone was certainly willing to keep an open mind. But, Craig, I'm not going to speak for you, but I'll speak for myself. In my heart, in my mind, and in my gut, I knew she had the wrong guy. And it didn't take the Bangkok press conference to convince me of that. But, again, this is the trust that we place in our public officials and certainly in our publicly elected district attorney that at this point in my life, I'm a lay citizen, and that she certainly was operating on a basis of facts and circumstances and knowledge that were beyond anything you or I had, and which we were simply speculating on.
Right, but those of us who followed the case closely, Steve, and nobody knows more about it than you do, when we heard about Michael Tracy being involved, it was a red flag. He's a guy who goes out in the media and elsewhere and says, nobody should have an opinion about anything. Nobody should speculate about anything. And, oh, by the way, the Ramseys are completely innocent. I mean, what is your feeling about CU Professor Michael Tracy?
Well, let me set it up this way, Craig. I worked narcotics for a long time, loved working narcotics. Anytime we had a person come forward with information, we always questioned that person's motivation. Was it a disgruntled girlfriend? Was it a mercenary? Was it someone looking for money? Was it an honest citizen witness? And when I learned that it was Professor Michael Tracy, and he has no love for me, I mean, that's apparent and has been for some time, but for Lacy not to judge, let me set it up this way. This was not a disinterested third-party citizen witness. Right. This was a person with a very vested interest in an intruder, which I think should have made the vetting process that much more thorough before acting on any information he brought forth.
Well, and Steve, wasn't that and isn't that going forward the problem with Mary Lacy as well, is she had a vested interest in an intruder. She took this case from the police, which was humiliating. You know, she endorsed Judge Karn's ruling in that civil case that an intruder did this, which was ludicrous. I mean, as a law enforcement tactic, ludicrous because, first of all, that was just presented by Darnay Hoffman to that federal court in Atlanta. It wasn't presented by real prosecutors with the full case file. Then she attends Patsy Ramsey's funeral. I mean, she had a vested interest in this being an intruder. She had a vested interest in this being Carr, and then look where it's left everything.
Well, no question, Dan. And I think her, even before all this public media scrutiny has arisen of late, her objectivity has been a concern within law enforcement. Her impartiality has been a concern. And I want to make a point for the fine men and women in the Boulder Police Department who continue day in, day out, going out and doing a good job. They were blindsided by this. Remember, this case was taken away from them in December of 2002 under threat of lawsuit, and they capitulated, surrendered the case, unprecedented, but they went back to the police department, dusted themselves off, and went out every day, did their jobs, and in return, they did not, in this case, even get a courtesy call that this arrest was coming down, blindsided by it, and then you saw at Keenan's press conference, politically, I think she tried to bring the law enforcement community onto that podium to bolster what has turned out to be a false arrest.
Steve, in your judgment, can the Boulder DA's office continue to be the investigative body on the JonBenet Ramsey murder? Doesn't it have to be turned back to the Boulder Police Department?
Well, I'll tell you, Craig, and it's an excellent question, and I never thought you would hear these words coming out of my mouth. But again, you hearken back to Alex Hunter, Trip DeMuth. At least these guys were reasonable in the regard that they would listen to you, that they would watch your presentation, that there would be a healthy and very aggressive debate back and forth, but without betraying any confidences. Let's just say that those who have tried to present Mary Keenan a non-intruder scenario have been given the coldest of shoulders. So, Craig, to answer your question, again, it may be a moot point 10 years on as to a prosecution, but I had always hoped that maybe there was an objective entity that may take this case over and look at it. Because at this point, it's clearly beyond the grasp and means and ability for the Boulder County DA's office to continue to investigate this case and hold ownership of it.
Yeah, well said, Steve. And you've been so generous with your time. We know that every media outlet in the country wants you, and you are kind enough to break your silence directly to the people of Colorado, and that's very much appreciated. My final question would be, and I think the answer is implicit in everything you've said in our last half hour, but at this point, do you think after the debacle we've just lived through, there's any real chance that eventually there will be justice in this case?
Well, I don't know that there'll be earthly justice, Dan. I think, and recently I was just privately contemplating the upcoming 10th anniversary of this case, and that it just may continue into eternity as an unresolved homicide, as sad as that is. But I just can't see, absent the state or somebody moving in and aggressively pursuing this case. Remember, cold case up to 2 weeks ago. Now this debacle, I just can't see. And Craig, I'd be interested in your thoughts. Anybody, Keenan's office ever prosecuting anyone for this case in any regard. I think that credibility and objectivity is lost.
Although if you had a DNA match and the guy was a pedophile, then we'd have to take that seriously. So I've learned to never say never, but I'll tell you one thing that I've never heard is anybody who questioned your motivation and desire to solve this case. Some people have questioned your theories, and because Boulder doesn't have a lot of homicides, you didn't have all that much homicide experience, but you worked as hard as a human being can work to solve this case, and you did the best job you could, and you've put your career on the line, and I think you're owed a debt of gratitude, and I'd match your professionalism up against Mary Lacy any day, and I think you'd be the winner.
Well, I'll tell you what, Craig, coming from you and Dan Capilis, I can't tell you how much that means to me. And I actually, believe it or not, I live down in Florida now. I'm in a different industry altogether, but I listen to you guys occasionally on KHOW, and I certainly appreciate the support. And I just wish today, Craig, instead, Colorado was rejoicing because the killer of John Benet Ramsey has been found, but unfortunately, and I don't say this lightly, Boulder, Colorado is once again just the embarrassment of the criminal justice system. And people will ask me, do you miss police work? I say, of course I miss police work, but not in Boulder, Colorado. And for any lingering question as to those who question my resignation, I think this simply adds an exclamation point to my departure, that I just could not operate in a system where this was what was occurring behind the scenes.
Well said, Steve, and you deserve better. The people of Boulder deserve better, but as you would be the first to say, above all, Jean Benet deserves better. And thank you for your time today and for everything you did on this case.
Thanks, Steve. Good luck to you.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Dan. All the best to you.
Take care. That's Steve Thomas, the lead detective in the Ramsey case. So it's the first thing he's had to say about this case in 5 years, and we appreciate him doing it here. But as he said off air before the interview, listen, this wanted to talk with the people of Colorado directly, and I'm glad that he did. Hey, we'll come back. Our lines are jammed, instant messages exploding, and we'll come back and dive right into that, update you on the events of the day, and there have been many. You're with Dan and Craig, 630 Kitch, We don't get fooled again. Oh, come on. How many times? How much damage are you going to let this district attorney do up in Boulder? I've been telling you for years, there is nothing more harmful than a bad district attorney, and that's what we've had in Mary Keenan. And then after the debacle at CU, she changed her name to Lacy. But look at the damage she wrought at CU, the millions of dollars, the loss of reputation for that great institution, the careers, the great people whose names forever tarnished because of her wild and wrong accusations. And Craig, we are about to post, we'll let you know when it's up, this extraordinary deposition testimony from Mary then Keenan in the CU case. And we're going to read it for you verbatim right now. We're going to get it posted on the web. But when we refer to it on air, Craig, folks can't believe it. And I first brought it up on air during the CU case when everybody was buying Mary Lacy's nonsense, that the top officials in the department, Barnett, Tharp, were aware that kids were using sex and alcohol to recruit and weren't doing anything about it, when people just bought it automatically because she's a DA. And I was trying to say, just because she's a DA doesn't mean what she's saying true. But admirably around here, we've become used to DAs not doing with their power what Mary Lacy has done with her power to destroy. But let me just read this verbatim into the record. Craig referred to it a second ago. And think about that as we go to the phone lines and you think about what happened with John Mark Carr today. And this goes to how she makes a decision as to prosecute. And the question is, and this question was being asked by Kay Rice, who did such a great job of cross-examining Mary Lacy, and then Dan Riley and Larry Posner in that firm went on and did a phenomenal job along with Kay Rice of defending CU in that case, and eventually Mary Lacy's allegations were just dismissed outright by a federal judge. But the question was, and you know what, to do this justice, we're going to have to hit a break. And if you're driving down the road, don't be mad at me, but I don't want to stop in the middle of this. When we come back from the break, we'll read you her full explanation as to how she makes the decision in her office whether to file charges. It will shock you.
Well, I know what the standard is. There are ABA standards. It says that a prosecutor should not bring charges unless they're convinced to reasonable certainty that they can prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt to a jury of 12 or 6 if it's a county court matter.
Yeah, and what we're going to read to you when we come back, you answer the question. Has Mary Lacy admitted in the deposition that she's violating the ethical standard with every case she decides to prosecute? I mean, it's really stunning stuff. Let's squeeze in a call, and we'll get instant messages as well. Mark, we'll have to make it quick. You're with Dan and Craig, 630 KHW.
Okay, Dan, you're a Boulder County resident, is that correct?
No, I'm not. When I got married, I moved to Denver.
Okay, well, in any case, I would like to start a recall petition against Mary Lacy, and I need some advice on how to do so.
Well, my friend, can you email me, and I'll be happy to communicate with you. Listen, I'm not a Boulder County resident. If a resident wants to start this up, believe me, I'll be happy to back it on air. I've been telling you for years she is dangerous, 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 and this just proves it again. When we come back, we'll take more calls, but we'll read you. It's short, and it's not a bunch of legal mumbo-jumbo, but in Mary now Lacy's own words, you can hear how she makes a charging decision in her office on sex cases. It'll stun you. You're with Dan and Craig, 630 KHW.